It began with a whisper, the kind so soft it almost felt like it might disappear if I acknowledged it. My daughter stood beside me, her small fingers clutching the edge of my sleeve, her eyes darting away as if she had already said too much. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no drama, no understanding of consequences, only simple honesty. She told me she had seen her mother kiss someone. Not a cartoon kiss, not the playful affection parents sometimes share, but something secretive, something she instinctively knew was not meant for her to witness. In that moment, innocence became the most powerful force in the room, because it delivered a truth no adult would dare to say so plainly. Children don't frame reality the way adults do. They don't soften words to protect feelings or hide facts behind excuses. My daughter didn't accuse, didn't exaggerate, and didn't even seem upset. She simply reported what she saw, the same way she might tell me about a bird on the window or a spilled glass of milk. That purity made her words impossible to ignore. If an adult had said it, I might have argued, denied it, or searched for an explanation that made it harmless. Coming from her, it felt unfiltered and undeniable, like reality speaking through the only voice that had no reason to lie. What shook me most was not just the content of her whisper, but the way she delivered it. She leaned closer, as if sharing a secret she didn't fully understand, sensing somehow that this information carried weight. Her confusion was visible. She knew it mattered, even if she didn't know why. That quiet uncertainty cut deeper than anger ever could. It was the first crack in the world I thought I understood, and it came from someone who trusted both parents equally, someone who still believed adults were supposed to be honest. In that instant, I felt two emotions collide. One was the instinct to protect my child, to keep her away from adult pain, adult mistakes, adult consequences. The other was a growing realization that she had already been pulled into something she shouldn't have seen. Her innocence had been breached not by cruelty, but by carelessness. A moment that should never have existed in her world had now become a permanent memory. And that made the truth heavier than betrayal alone. The power of her whisper lay in its simplicity. There were no dramatic accusations, no emotional manipulation, no hidden motives. Just a child telling her parent what she saw, trusting that the adults would make sense of it. That trust felt sacred. It forced me to listen in a way I might not have if the truth had arrived through confrontation or suspicion. It was the kind of moment that rewires you, because you realize that innocence doesn't just observe reality, it exposes it, raw and undeniable. By the time she finished speaking, nothing had technically changed yet. No arguments had happened, no proof had been shown, and yet everything was already different. That single whisper became the beginning of a truth I could no longer avoid, delivered by the one person in the family who never meant to reveal anything at all. At first, I tried to tell myself it meant nothing. A child's words, after all, can be misunderstood, reshaped by imagination, or missing context. I replayed her whisper in my head again and again, each time searching for a harmless explanation that would let life continue as it was. Maybe it was a friendly gesture. Maybe she'd confused what she saw. Maybe I was letting fear fill in the blanks. Suspicion arrived quietly, not as anger, but as a restless discomfort that refused to go away. It sat in my chest, heavy but undefined, asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. I began to notice small things I had ignored before. The way my wife guarded her phone, angling the screen away from me, smiling at messages she never shared. The sudden changes in her schedule that came with casual excuses, delivered too quickly to feel natural. None of these moments were proof on their own, and that was what made them dangerous. Each detail could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern that whispered back at me, echoing my daughter's words. Suspicion grew not from a single discovery, but from the slow accumulation of doubt. Days passed, and the discomfort turned into vigilance. I found myself watching instead of living, listening more carefully to tones of voice, studying expressions for cracks. Ordinary conversations felt rehearsed, as if we were both reading from scripts written to avoid the truth. I hated that version of myself, the one who doubted, who measured affection, who searched for meaning in silence. Yet I couldn't stop. Once suspicion takes root, it doesn't need evidence to survive. It feeds on uncertainty. The devastation didn't arrive all at once. It crept closer through moments that should have been reassuring but weren't. A late night that went unanswered, a laugh that didn't reach her eyes when I asked simple questions. Even physical closeness felt different, as if something essential had been withdrawn without explanation. What hurt most was the emotional distance growing where trust once lived. I realized that betrayal isn't only about what happens behind your back. It's also about what disappears right in front of you. When the truth finally began to reveal itself, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no explosive confrontation, no single moment of clarity. Instead, it felt like exhaustion giving way to acceptance. The pieces fit together too well to ignore anymore. Suspicion had done its quiet work, preparing me for devastation long before I was ready to face it. By the time certainty arrived, part of me had already mourned the marriage I thought I had. The worst part was understanding that this slow unraveling was unavoidable once it began. Suspicion had turned my home into unfamiliar territory, and every unanswered question widened the distance between us. What started as a child's innocent observation had transformed into a relentless awareness that something was fundamentally broken. And in that realization, devastation wasn't a sudden collapse. It was the moment I understood that the life I trusted no longer existed in the way I believed it did. Once the truth settled into place, it wasn't the anger that hurt the most. It was the quiet understanding that something sacred had been damaged beyond easy repair. Trust in a family isn't loud or dramatic. It's built in routines, shared glances, and the unspoken belief that home is a safe place. When that trust breaks, it doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes. I felt it in the way the house sounded different, as if the walls themselves had grown distant. Familiar rooms no longer carried comfort, only reminders of what had been assumed and now questioned. The deepest wound came from realizing that the betrayal didn't just affect me and my wife. It reached our daughter, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. Families are meant to be shelters where children learn what love looks like by watching their parents. When that example is corrupted, even silently, it leaves a mark. I began to see how fragile that lesson was, how easily a child's sense of normal could be altered by adult choices. The thought that she might one day look back and connect moments she shouldn't have had to notice filled me with a heavy, protective guilt. Conversations became careful, measured. Words were chosen not for honesty but for damage control. Trust, once broken, changes the purpose of communication. Instead of bringing people closer, it becomes a tool to avoid further harm. I noticed how questions were met with defensiveness, how explanations sounded practiced rather than sincere. Even apologies, when they came, felt incomplete, weighed down by what remained unsaid. It became clear that trust isn't restored by words alone. It requires transparency that had already been denied. What made it worse was the isolation that followed. Friends and family still saw us as the same unit, unaware of the fracture running through everything. Smiles in public felt like performances, and laughter became something borrowed rather than felt. Inside, I carried the knowledge that the foundation of our family had shifted, and no one else could see it. That private burden intensified the sense of betrayal, because it forced me to protect the image of a family that no longer felt whole. At night, when the house was quiet, the reality felt heavier. Trust, I realized, is what allows rest. It's what lets you sleep without questioning, love without calculating, and believe without proof. Without it, even silence becomes suspicious. I found myself replaying years of memories, wondering which moments were genuine and which were layered with deception. That uncertainty was more painful than the truth itself. In the end, the greatest damage wasn't just the act of betrayal. It was the loss of certainty. The knowledge that the people you rely on most can create wounds that reach everyone under the same roof. Family trust, once broken, doesn't simply mend with time. It changes shape forever, leaving behind a careful, guarded version of love where unconditional belief once lived. I thought I was prepared for whatever came next. By the time suspicion hardened into something close to certainty, I believed I had already faced the worst possible outcome. A secret kiss, an emotional lapse, a mistake that could be confronted, explained, maybe even forgiven. My mind kept shrinking the truth into something manageable, something that fit within the boundaries of pain I thought I could survive. That illusion shattered the moment I stopped looking for reassurance and started seeing what was actually there. The details didn't arrive dramatically. They surfaced quietly, almost indifferently, as if the truth didn't care whether I was ready for it or not. A name I recognized too well, a timeline that stretched further back than I wanted to admit, conversations that weren't just flirtation, but planning. The realization hit me slowly, and then all at once. This wasn't a single moment of weakness. It was a sustained choice. The kiss my daughter saw wasn't the beginning of something. It was just one scene in a story that had already been unfolding for far longer than I knew. What made it worse wasn't only the depth of the betrayal, but how seamlessly it had been hidden within our daily life. Family dinners, shared jokes, ordinary routines. All of it had continued alongside a parallel reality I was never meant to see. I replayed past months with new awareness, recognizing gaps that now made sense. The late errands, the emotional distance I once blamed on stress, the subtle shift in priorities that I dismissed as temporary. Each memory rearranged itself, forming a clearer, more devastating picture. The most painful escalation came when I realized how close this other life had come to our family. This wasn't a distant affair, kept safely outside the walls of our home. It brushed against it, sometimes entered it, sometimes existed just out of sight. The boundary between family and betrayal had been crossed repeatedly, without hesitation. That knowledge felt violating, as if something private and sacred had been accessed without permission, and then casually returned to place. I had expected anger to be the dominant emotion, but instead there was a hollow disbelief. The shock didn't come from learning that I had been betrayed. It came from understanding how thoroughly I had been excluded from the truth. Decisions had been made about my life, my marriage, and my family without my consent or awareness. The scale of that exclusion was overwhelming. It wasn't just about love redirected elsewhere. It was about trust removed entirely. In that moment, I understood why the truth felt worse than anything I had imagined. It stripped away not only the relationship I believed in, but also my confidence in my own perception. I questioned how I hadn't seen it sooner, how normal life had continued while something so destructive existed beneath it. The escalation wasn't louder or more dramatic. It was deeper. It reached into every assumption I had made about my past and forced me to reconsider what had been real. By the time everything was finally visible, there was no comfort in knowing. The truth didn't offer closure or clarity. It only confirmed that what I feared was smaller than what actually was. And that realization marked the point where denial ended, and the consequences truly began. After everything came into the open, there was no sudden resolution, no clean ending that tied the pain into something understandable. What followed was fallout, quiet, relentless, and deeply personal. The betrayal didn't stay confined to the past. It spilled forward into every decision that had to be made next. I wasn't just dealing with what had happened, but with what it meant for the future of a family that now felt fragile and uncertain. The weight of responsibility pressed harder than anger ever had. The most difficult part was navigating the emotional aftermath for my daughter. Children don't need full explanations to sense when something is wrong. She noticed the change in tone, the pauses in conversation, the way warmth faded from everyday moments. Protecting her became the central concern, even as I struggled to process my own emotions. Every choice had to balance honesty with safety, truth with stability. I realized that adulthood sometimes means carrying pain quietly, so a child doesn't have to carry it at all. Confrontation didn't bring relief the way I imagined it might. Words were exchanged, apologies offered, explanations given, but none of them erased the damage. Accountability mattered, yet it couldn't undo what had already altered our lives. The consequences were not just emotional, they were structural. Trust had to be renegotiated, boundaries redefined, and the future reconsidered with realism instead of hope alone. Love, once effortless, now required conscious effort and difficult conversations. There was also a moral reckoning that went beyond the marriage itself. I had to confront what example was being set, what values were being modeled in silence. Staying, leaving, forgiving, or walking away. None of these choices were simple, and all of them carried consequences that would echo for years. The idea that a child learns what relationships look like by watching her parents became impossible to ignore. That awareness forced me to think less about my own hurt and more about long-term impact. In quieter moments, the emotional toll surfaced in unexpected ways. Sleep became lighter, thoughts heavier. I questioned my own judgment, my role in what had happened, and the limits of forgiveness. Healing didn't move in a straight line. Some days felt almost normal, while others reopened wounds I thought had begun to close. The fallout wasn't dramatic. It was persistent, reshaping daily life piece by piece. Ultimately, the consequences were about acceptance. Accepting that some damage can be managed but never erased. Accepting that family bonds can survive betrayal, but only in altered form. And accepting that responsibility doesn't end with discovering the truth. It begins there. The moral and emotional aftermath became a test of character, patience, and resilience, defining not just how the story ended, but how everyone involved would carry it forward.